The storm arrived before the night did, crashing against the jagged cliffs of the Oregon coast with the fury of a living thing. Inside the Blackwood Lighthouse, Jack Thorne stood by the reinforced glass, watching the Atlantic churn into a violent froth of gray and black. At 38, Jack was a man composed of sharp edges and silence. He had traded the noise of the city and the haunting memories of his years as a search and rescue pilot for the solitude of this rock. The only sound in the circular room was the rhythmic sweeping of the light beam and the low, steady breathing of Buster, his three-legged Rottweiler dozing on the rug. Jack took a sip of cold coffee, his eyes scanning the narrow access road that wound dangerously along the cliff edge. It was a road no one used, not in this weather. Not ever, really. But then, Buster's head snapped up. The dog let out a low, vibrating growl deep in his chest. Jack frowned, setting his mug down.
"What is it, boy?"
He followed the dog's gaze. Down below, where the rain slashed sideways like silver needles, a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. They were erratic, swerving violently before coming to a sudden, jarring halt, dangerously close to the guardrail. The engine died. The lights flickered and went out. For a long moment, nothing moved. "Foolish," Jack muttered, grabbing his heavy oilskin coat from the hook. "Driving in a gale like this?" He didn't intend to get involved. He intended to tap on the window, tell them to turn around, and retreat back to his tower. But as he stepped out into the howling wind, rain instantly soaking his face, instinct, the same instinct that had saved dozens of lives and lost a few, screamed that this wasn't just a breakdown. He made his way down the slippery stone steps, his flashlight cutting a beam through the deluge. Buster limped valiantly at his side, ignoring the wind that tried to knock him over. When Jack reached the vehicle, a battered dark sedan, he saw her. The driver's side window was shattered, likely from the impact with a falling branch. Inside, a woman sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. She wasn't looking at the storm. She was looking at the rearview mirror, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the weather. In the back seat, huddled under a pile of coats, was a small boy, no older than 6. He had a pair of oversized headphones over his ears and was clutching a toy robot as if it were a lifeline. Jack tapped on the glass. The woman flinched violently, a gasp tearing from her throat. She looked at him, and in the beam of his flashlight, Jack saw a bruise darkening her cheekbone, fresh and angry. She didn't roll down the window. She locked the door. "It's unsafe here," Jack shouted over the roar of the wind, his voice rough but steady. "The road is washing out ahead.
"You can't stay in the car."
She shook her head frantically, mouthing words he couldn't hear, but he could read her lips. "He's coming. He's coming." Jack narrowed his eyes. He looked back up the dark, winding road. There were no other lights, just the abyss of the storm. He looked back at her. "Listen to me," he commanded, his tone shifting from annoyed civilian to commanding officer. "The cliffside is unstable. If you stay here, you slide into the ocean. Do you understand?" The woman looked at her son in the back seat. The boy looked up, meeting Jack's gaze through the rain-streaked glass. The kid didn't look scared. He looked resigned, like he was used to bad things happening in the dark. That look broke something in Jack's chest. "Open the door," Jack said, softer this time, placing a large, calloused hand against the cold metal of the car. "I have a warm place, just up the stairs. No one can get to you there. I promise." "I promise." He hadn't made a promise in 5 years,
Not since the crash that ended his career.
The woman hesitated, her hand trembling over the handle. She scanned the darkness one last time, then looked at Jack's face. She saw the scar running through his eyebrow, the gray in his beard, and the steady, unmoving calm in his eyes. Click. The lock disengaged. Jack didn't wait. He pulled the door open, the wind nearly ripping it from his grasp. "Grab the boy," he said. "Leave the car. We move now." She scrambled into the back, unbuckling the child. She pulled him into her arms, wrapping him in a trench coat, and stepped out into the gale. She was small, fragile-looking, but she moved with a desperate strength. "Follow the dog," Jack ordered, pointing to Buster, who was waiting by the stairs like a sentinel. They climbed the stone steps in silence, the wind screaming around them, the ocean crashing below like a hungry beast waiting to be fed. When they finally stepped inside the heavy iron door of the lighthouse base, the silence was sudden and deafening. Jack slammed the deadbolt home, locking out the storm, and turned to face them. The woman stood dripping on the mat, shivering uncontrollably. The boy peeked out from her coat, his eyes wide. "I'm Jack," he said simply, hanging up his coat. He didn't ask who hurt her. He didn't ask who was chasing her. He knew that stories like hers came out slowly, like blood seeping through a bandage. "I'm Clara," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is Leo." Jack nodded. He walked over to the wood stove and threw in another log, the fire crackling to life. "Warm up," he said. "You're safe here. For tonight, the world stops at that door." But as Clara sank to the floor, pulling Leo tight against her chest, Jack looked out the window one last time. Far down the road, at the edge of the tree line, a pair of headlights flickered on, sitting still in the darkness. Watching. Jack reached into a locked drawer near his desk and pulled out a flare gun, setting it on the table. The storm outside was dangerous, but the storm Clara had brought with her was just beginning. The lighthouse kitchen smelled of damp wool and heating tomato soup. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic blackness pressing against the thick glass windows. Jack moved with the economy of a man who lived alone. He set 2 mugs on the wooden table, the steam rising in lazy spirals. "Eat," he said, his voice low. "Adrenaline burns fast. You'll need the fuel." Clara sat on the edge of the wooden chair, her body angled toward the door as if she expected it to burst open at any second. She hadn't taken off her coat. Her eyes darted around the circular room, taking in the maps on the walls, the old radio equipment, and the flare gun resting heavily on the side table. "You're not just a lighthouse keeper," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jack didn't look up from the stove. "I used to find people who didn't want to be found, or couldn't be." He poured a smaller cup for the boy. "Now, I just make sure ships don't hit the rocks." He placed the cup in front of Leo. The boy hadn't moved since they sat down. His headphones were still around his neck, the toy robot clutched in a white-knuckled grip. Buster, the 3-legged Rottweiler, limped over. He didn't bark. He simply sat beside Leo's chair and rested his heavy block of a head on the boy's knee. Leo froze. He looked at his mother, panic flaring in his eyes. "He's fine," Jack said, leaning back against the counter, crossing his arms. "Buster lost that leg trying to pull a hiker out of a ravine 3 years ago. He knows what it's like to be hurt. He won't touch you." Slowly, hesitantly, Leo's hand uncurled from the robot. His small fingers brushed the coarse fur between the dog's ears. Buster let out a long, contented sigh, closing his eyes. For the first time, the tension in Leo's shoulders dropped an inch. Clara watched the interaction, and her eyes welled up. She blinked the tears away rapidly. "His name is Marcus," she whispered. "The man in the car. He's a detective. A dirty one." Jack's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "That explains why you didn't run to the police." "He is the police," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "He said if I ever tried to leave, he'd make sure no one would ever find us. He said the law works for him, not me." "The law doesn't reach out here," Jack said flatly. "This is federal land, and on this rock, I'm the only law that matters." Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the room plunged into darkness. The hum of the electric heater died, leaving only the roar of the storm and the orange glow of the embers in the wood stove. "Did he do that?" Clara gasped, pulling Leo toward her. "No," Jack said calmly, reaching for a heavy flashlight from his belt. "The grid goes down in storms like this. The backup generator for the light will kick in, but the house runs on oil lamps tonight." He struck a match. The flare of sulfur was sharp in the air. As he lit an old brass lantern, the shadows in the room stretched and danced like ghosts. Jack walked to the window, shielding the light so he could see out. The headlights down at the tree line were gone. But that didn't mean the car was gone. "Stay here," Jack ordered. "Lock the door behind me." "Where are you going?" Clara stood up, panic rising. "Checking the perimeter." Jack grabbed the flare gun and a heavy iron pry bar from the corner. He stepped out into the freezing vestibule. He heard the heavy bolt slide shut behind him. Good. She was learning. He stepped outside. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off the gantry. The rain was blinding. Jack moved around the walkway, circling the tower, his flashlight cutting through the deluge. Nothing on the north side. Nothing on the east. He rounded the corner to the south side, facing the access road. He stopped. The chain-link gate at the bottom of the stairs, which he always kept padlocked, was swinging open. The metal groaned rhythmically against the post. Clang, clang, clang. The padlock wasn't just broken. It had been cut. Jack killed his flashlight instantly, plunging himself into darkness. He knew this terrain better than anyone. He didn't need light. He needed stealth. He crouched low against the railing, listening. Beneath the howl of the wind, he heard the crunch of boots on wet gravel. Heavy steps. Deliberate. Someone was coming up the stairs. Jack griped the flare gun tight. He waited until the footsteps were halfway up, exposed on the narrow stone path. Then he stood up and clicked the flashlight back on, aiming the beam directly into the face of the figure on the stairs. "That's far enough," Jack yelled, his voice booming over the storm. The figure stopped. It was a man in a dark raincoat, tall, broad-shouldered. He held one hand up to shield his eyes from the blinding light. In his other hand, held low by his side, was something metallic that glinted in the beam. "Car trouble," the man shouted back. His voice was smooth, too smooth. "Just looking for help, friend." "I'm not your friend," Jack shouted. "And I saw you cut the lock. Turn around, now." The man smiled. It was a cold, practiced smile. "You have something of mine in there, old man. I just want my family back. Don't make this a tragedy." The man took another step up. Jack raised the flare gun. "Take one more step, and I won't need the police to identify your body." I'll burn a hole through you so bright they'll see it from the mainland." The man paused. He weighed the threat. He looked at the flare gun, then at Jack's face. He realized this wasn't a bluff. Slowly, the man took a step back. "You're making a mistake," he called out. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know I'm dealing with a trespasser," Jack replied. "Get off my rock." The man lingered for a second longer, his eyes full of promise, the kind of promise that meant violence. Then, he turned and began to descend the stairs, disappearing into the black rain. Jack watched him go until he saw the taillights of the sedan finally retreat down the coast road. He didn't relax. He knew men like that. They didn't leave, they just regrouped. Jack turned to go back inside, but as he reached for the door handle, he saw something wedged into the door frame. It was a picture, a photograph. He pulled it loose. It was damp, but the image was clear. It was a photo of Jack, taken from a distance just yesterday, buying supplies in town. On the back, written in thick black marker, were 3 words. "No witnesses left." Jack crumpled the photo in his fist. He opened the door and stepped back into the warmth, locking the world out once more. Clara looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. Was it him? Jack looked at the woman, then at the boy sleeping against the dog. He tossed the pry bar onto the table with a heavy thud. "Yeah," Jack said, his voice grim. "It was him. And he's not done." Jack walked over to the radio set in the corner. He began to twist the dials, searching for a frequency through the static. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Calling in a favor," Jack said. "Because if we stay here until morning, we're dead." Static hissed through the speaker, harsh and rhythmic, syncing with the lightning flashing outside. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Watchtower Actual, requesting immediate relay on Channel 9. Over." Jack's voice was calm, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the microphone handset. Clara stood by the stove, holding a heavy iron poker she had pulled from the fire tools. Leo was awake now, sitting up, his eyes wide and fixed on the locked door. A voice crackled back through the static, distorted but audible. "Watchtower? Jack? I haven't heard that call sign in 5 years. You sound like hell." "Miller," Jack said, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "I have a situation. 3 hostiles, armed, 1 dirty badge, civilians in tow. I need an extraction." A pause. The wind howled against the glass, rattling the frames. "Jack, look outside." Miller's voice came back, tight with regret. "The ceiling is 0. Gusts are hitting 60 knots. I can't put a bird in the air, let alone land on that rock. I'd kill you all just trying." Jack closed his eyes for a second. The memory of a spinning rotor and screaming metal flashed behind his eyelids. He pushed it down. "I can't stay here, Miller. They've cut the perimeter. They're coming in." "Get to the ridge," Miller said urgently. "The old logging road, 3 miles north. If you can get to the tree line, I can drop a team in with ATVs from the main highway. But you have to get off that rock on foot." "Copy. The ridge. Out." Jack dropped the handset. He turned to Clara. "Change of plans. We're leaving." "In this?" Clara gestured to the black void outside. "We'll freeze." "Better to freeze than to burn," Jack said grimly. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed from the bottom of the lighthouse. It wasn't thunder. It was the heavy iron door downstairs being breached. Buster barked, a deep, thunderous sound that bounced off the stone walls. "They're inside," Jack whispered. He moved quickly. He grabbed a heavy coil of rope and the flare gun. He knelt in front of Leo. The boy was trembling, tears streaming down his face. Jack placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Leo, look at me." The boy looked up. "I need you to be a shadow," Jack said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We're going to play a game. We have to be quiet, and we have to be fast. Can you do that?" Leo nodded slowly. He clutched his robot tighter. "Good man." Jack stood up and turned to Clara. "There's no back door," she said, panic edging into her voice. "It's a tower. There's only one way down." "There's always another way," Jack said. He kicked aside the rug Buster had been sleeping on, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor with an iron ring. "The old fuel chute. It leads to the sea caves below. At low tide, there's a path up the cliff face." "And if it's high tide?" Clara asked. "Then we swim," Jack said. He heaved the trapdoor open. A rush of cold, damp air smelling of salt and rot billowed up. From the spiral staircase below, heavy footsteps echoed. They were taking their time. They knew there was no escape. "Go," Jack ordered. "Take the flashlight. Don't stop until you hit sand." Clara lowered herself into the hole, helping Leo down. Buster followed, scrambling awkwardly but without hesitation. Jack stayed behind for one last second. He grabbed a bottle of kerosene from the shelf and smashed it at the top of the stairs. He lit a match and dropped it. Whoosh! A wall of fire erupted across the landing, blocking the entrance to the lantern room. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy them minutes. Jack slid down the chute and pulled the trapdoor shut above him, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Lights off," Jack whispered to Clara. "Sound carries." They moved through the damp, narrow tunnel, the stones slick with algae. Above them, muffled by layers of rock and iron, Jack could hear shouting. They emerged into the sea cave. The roar of the ocean was deafening here. The tide was high, crashing violently against the mouth of the cave, sending spray hissing into the dark. "The path is flooded!" Clara screamed over the noise. Jack shined his light. She was right. The water was churning waist-deep over the narrow ledge that hugged the cave wall. "We have to cross it!" Jack shouted. "Tie this around your waist." He lashed the rope around Clara, then Leo, and finally himself. "Move! Keep your back to the wall." They stepped onto the ledge. The water was freezing, shocking the breath from their lungs. Waves smashed against them, trying to drag them into the black depths. Halfway across, Jack looked up. At the top of the cliff, silhouetted against the stormy sky, a flashlight beam swept down. They had been spotted. A gunshot cracked, a sharp ping against the rock just inches from Jack's head. "Cover!" Jack roared, shoving Clara and Leo into a crevice in the rock face. He raised the flare gun. He had one shot. He didn't aim at the shooter. He aimed at the loose shale overhang directly above the gunman. He pulled the trigger. The red flare shrieked into the night, illuminating the rain in a blood-colored haze. It struck the unstable rock face with an explosion of light and sparks. The cliff groaned. The explosion of light was followed instantly by the grinding roar of stone tearing loose. The shale overhang, weakened by decades of salt spray and the sudden impact of the flare, collapsed. Tons of wet rock cascaded down the cliff face, taking the shooter's vantage point with it. There was a shout cut short by the crash of debris into the churning surf below. "Move!" Jack yelled, hauling on the rope. "Don't look down, just climb!" Clara didn't look. She scrambled up the slick, wet basalt, her fingers bleeding, shoving Leo upward with every ounce of hysterical strength she possessed. Jack brought up the rear, one hand gripping the rope, the other hauling the three-legged dog up the steepest sections by his harness. They crested the lip of the sea cave and collapsed onto the mossy floor of the forest. The wind here was less violent, broken by the dense canopy of ancient spruce trees, but the cold was biting. "Are they dead?" Clara gasped, clutching Leo, who was shivering violently. "One of them is gone," Jack said, his chest heaving. He checked the breech of the flare gun. Empty. He tossed it aside. It was useless now. "But the others will hear the slide. We have to make the ridge before they regroup." He looked at Leo. The boy's lips were turning blue. Jack stripped off his heavy oilskin coat. Underneath, he wore only a thick wool sweater. He wrapped the oversized coat around the boy, buttoning it to the chin. "You look like a giant," Jack said, forcing a grin he didn't feel. Leo looked up, his teeth chattering. But he managed a tiny, brave nod. "Up on my back," Jack commanded. "We move faster if I carry you." He hoisted the boy effortlessly. "Clara, hold on to my belt. If you fall, I stop. If I stop, you push me. Understood?" "Understood," she whispered. They ran. The trek through the forest was a nightmare of mud and shadows. Branches whipped at their faces. Roots tried to snare their ankles. But Jack moved with the relentless pace of a machine. He navigated by instinct and memory, leading them through ravines and over fallen logs, always heading north. Buster limped ahead, his nose to the ground, guiding them away from the treacherous drops. After 20 minutes, the trees began to thin. The ground leveled out. "We're close," Jack rasped. "The old logging road is just past this rise. Miller said he'd have a team there." Hope surged in Clara's eyes. "We're going to make it." They scrambled up the final embankment, their boots sliding in the mud, and burst onto the gravel service road. It was empty. Rain lashed against the gray stones. There were no ATVs, no rescue team. Just the dark, desolate road stretching into the mist. "Where are they?" Clara's voice broke. Jack scanned the tree line, his stomach twisting. "Miller is never late," he muttered. "Something's wrong." Buster let out a low, menacing growl, the hair on his back standing straight up. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking behind them, back the way they had come. A slow, sarcastic clapping sound echoed from the darkness of the trees. Clara froze. Jack slowly set Leo down, pushing the boy behind his legs. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It wasn't the man from the cliff. It was Marcus. He looked impeccable, despite the storm. His raincoat was buttoned, his gun drawn but held casually at his side. He was flanked by 2 other men, large, silent shapes in the gloom. "You really thought you could outrun me in my own county?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "I knew about the logging road before you even made the call. I monitor all emergency frequencies, Clara. You know that." He stepped onto the road, the gravel crunching under his boots. "The rescue chopper isn't coming," Marcus smiled. "I called it off, told them it was a false alarm, a domestic dispute resolved." Clara let out a sob of pure despair. Jack stepped forward, shielding her and the boy. He had no weapon, no flare gun, just a pry bar he had tucked into his belt and his bare hands. "Let them go," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is between you and me now." Marcus laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "You? You're just a washed-up lighthouse keeper. You're nothing. I'm going to put a bullet in you, take my wife and son home, and tell the papers you were a deranged kidnapper." He raised the gun, aiming directly at Jack's chest. Say goodbye, hero. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at Buster. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and in that split second, before Marcus could pull the trigger, a blinding white light exploded from the sky above them. The roar of a helicopter engine tore the night apart. The rotor wash flattened the tall grass, whipping the rain into a frenzy that stung like buckshot. Marcus shielded his eyes, stumbling back, his aim ruined. The helicopter hovered dangerously low, its spotlight pinning the corrupt detective to the mud like a specimen on a slide. A voice boomed from the chopper's PA system, cutting through the storm. "Federal agents, drop the weapon, now!" Miller hadn't just sent a rescue team, he had called in the FBI. Marcus's face twisted in a snarl. He didn't drop the gun. He swung it back toward Jack. But Jack was already moving. He didn't run. He launched himself low, his shoulder slamming into Marcus's midsection with the force of a battering ram. The breath left Marcus in a wet gasp, and the gun discharged into the gravel, the shot lost in the roar of the rotors. They hit the ground hard. Mud and water splashed violently. Marcus was younger, but Jack fought with the desperate, calculated rage of a man protecting the innocent. He trapped Marcus's wrist, twisting it until the bone audibly popped. Marcus screamed, and the gun slipped from his fingers, disappearing into the dark grass. "Stay down!" Jack roared, pinning Marcus to the earth. The two henchmen tried to run, but from the darkness of the tree line, red laser sights dotted their chests. 4 tactical officers in full gear emerged from the woods, weapons raised. Miller's ground team had been there the whole time, waiting for the signal. "Hands! Let me see your hands!" The henchmen dropped to their knees, surrendering. Buster barked once, sharp and final, standing guard over Clara and Leo, who were huddled together, safe behind the wall of officers. Jack slowly released his grip on Marcus. He stood up, wiping mud and blood from his face. He looked down at the man who had terrorized a woman and a child for years. "You were right about one thing," Jack said, his breath visible in the cold spotlight. "The local law doesn't reach out here, but justice does." Agents swarmed in, cuffing Marcus, reading him his rights. As they dragged him away, he looked back at Clara. But she wasn't looking at the ground anymore. She was looking right at him, her chin lifted, her eyes dry and fierce. She was no longer running. Spring came to the Oregon coast 3 months later. The wildflowers bloomed in purple and gold patches along the cliff edge, and the ocean, once a black monster, now sparkled a brilliant turquoise under the sun. Jack stood on the catwalk of the Blackwood Lighthouse, painting the railing a fresh, bright white. His leg still ached when it rained, a souvenir from that night on the ridge, but he didn't mind. It was a good kind of pain, the kind that reminded you that you were alive. A yellow Jeep pulled up the long, winding driveway. Jack smiled, setting his brush down. Buster, now sporting a shiny new collar, bounded down the stairs on his 3 good legs, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. Clara stepped out of the car. She looked different. The bruises were long gone, replaced by a healthy flush in her cheeks. She wore a simple sundress, her hair loose in the wind. Leo jumped out from the passenger side. He wasn't wearing his headphones. He wasn't clutching the robot. "Jack!" the boy yelled, sprinting up the path. He didn't stop until he slammed into Jack's legs, wrapping his small arms around the man's waist. Jack froze for a second, then gently patted the boy's back. "Hey, kid, you keeping out of trouble?" "Mom got a job," Leo beamed, looking up. "And I made the soccer team. I'm a goalie. Nothing gets past me." "I bet," Jack chuckled. "You learned from the best." Clara walked up the steps, carrying a basket covered in a checkered cloth. She stopped in front of Jack, the ocean breeze playing with her hair. "We brought lunch," she said softly. "I thought maybe you were tired of canned soup." Jack looked at her, really looked at her. The shadows that had haunted her eyes that first night were gone. In their place was a quiet, steady light. "I could use a break," Jack admitted. They sat on the grassy knoll overlooking the sea. They ate sandwiches and watched Leo throw a frisbee for Buster, the boy's laughter ringing out clear and bright, mixing with the cry of the gulls. For 5 years, Jack had lived on this rock, believing that his life was over, that he was just a ghost haunting a tower of stone. He thought his job was only to warn people away from the danger. But as he watched Clara smile at something Leo said, Jack realized the storm had washed away more than just the debris on the cliffs. It had washed away the ghosts. He wasn't just a keeper of the light anymore. He was part of it. "You know," Clara said, leaning back on her hands, watching the horizon, "they say this is the loneliest place on the coast." Jack took a sip of iced tea, watching the 3-legged dog chase the boy through the flowers. "No," Jack said, a genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. "Not anymore."